The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome, everyone. I am Jay Parsons of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's American Sheep Industry webinar titled Protecting the Flock from Highly Contagious Diseases, Resources in the Secure Sheep and Wool Supply Plan. This webinar is brought to you by the Let's Grow Committee of the American Sheep Industry Association. We want to thank them for their support and encourage you to visit the ASI website to learn more about the sheep industry and access the large volume of resources available there to help you be successful in the sheep business. The URL for the ASI website is www.sheepusa.org. Once again, that's www.sheepusa.org. I'd like to remind our listeners that this webinar is being recorded. All webinar registrants will receive a follow-up email within the next 48 hours with a link to the webinar recording, as well as a link to access the webinar slides. The links will also be posted on the ASI website alongside recordings from our previous webinars in the Let's Grow educational materials. We are slated for about 45 minutes of presentation time, followed by about 20 minutes of question and answers with our presenter this evening. Feel free to submit your questions at any time, including during the presentation, by typing them into the question dialog box at the bottom of your control panel. I will monitor these questions throughout the evening, and I will moderate them to our presenter during the Q&A session after the presentation. If you wish to interact with our presenter directly during the Q&A session, there will be an opportunity to do that too, as long as you have a microphone connected to your computer. And I'll go over those instructions when we hit that portion of the program. It's now my pleasure to welcome our speaker this evening, Dr. Danelle Bickett-Weddle. Dr. Bickett-Weddle is the Associate Director of the Center for Food Security and Public Health at Iowa State University. She also works with the ISU Extension and Outreach. She's passionate about biosecurity, public health, and the livestock industry, and combines these topics in her work educating livestock producers, veterinarians, veterinary students, and the public about animal diseases and how to protect themselves and their livelihood. She has developed resources for the Secure Food Supply Plan since 2009. She has a DVM and PhD degree from Iowa State University, and the University of Iowa. She has a master's in public health from there. She also teaches a public health emergency preparedness course for the University of Iowa. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Bickett-Weddle, and it's a pleasure to have you here this evening, Doctor, and take it away from here.
Thank you, Jay. Really appreciate the opportunity to connect with your audience tonight. Some of the things we'll talk about is foot and mouth disease. It's the most highly contagious viral disease of cloven hoof livestock and cloven hoof wildlife. Talk a little bit about the U.S. response plan. And then finally, the resources available to prepare in the Secure Sheep and Wool Supply Plan for continuity of business. Again, like Jay said, if you have questions, I look forward to them. So foot and mouth disease is considered the most contagious viral disease of livestock throughout the world. It is the disease, above all, that limits world trade among countries of the animals themselves and of animal products. Now, this disease doesn't cause death in adult animals. It causes pretty severe lameness, mouth sores, teeth lesions, and that. In young animals, we do see high mortality. So in our lambs, in our calves, in our piglets, can be found in some of the viral strains. The pictures you see on the screen before you do show a lot of mortality, but that is because that's one of our control strategies. If this disease comes into a country where it's not been seen before, like the United States has experienced, then we would have to do what we call depopulation, or a stamping out procedure. So the United Kingdom in 2001, people probably remember some of those images. We also had it in South Korea in 2010, as well as Japan, and then Egypt as recently as 2012. The United States has not had an outbreak since 1929. That's a long time ago. We're going to spend some of your valuable time tonight talking about a disease we haven't seen, but it's the consequences, if that were to ever come to the United States, that we're really concerned about. So if we think about it globally, where do we find foot and mouth disease? Well, it's stated that it's found in about 2/3 of the countries of the world. There's 66 countries that are free of FMD. And this comes to you from a paper published back in 2012. There's a lot of countries that have never been free, so it's considered endemic there. But in North America, we've not had an outbreak since 1954 in Mexico, 1952 in Canada, and as I mentioned, 1929 here in the United States. So you saw those pictures on the previous slides of those animals being depopulated. And that's how all of these outbreaks in North America have been controlled in years past. We're going to talk a little bit tonight about how that plus another strategy is being considered, several strategies actually, as part of our approach to controlling a foot and mouth disease outbreak in the United States. So these show some of the species differences. So I mentioned that this is a cloven-hoofed animal disease. So any animal with a split toe. Horses, not susceptible. So sheep, goats, swine, and cattle are the domestic species that we most often see associated with foot and mouth disease. Sheep are what's considered the maintenance host. They can spread it silently because they don't show real obvious clinical signs. Swine, on the other hand, are what we call our amplifying hosts. They're little viral factories. So once that virus gets into a swine population, they can produce millions of infective doses every single day. Cattle, we kind of talk about them being the host that shows the most. They're often the first species that we'll see with clinical signs. So if a herd of cattle was intermixed with a flock of sheep, you may not ever see clinical signs in the sheep themselves, but you could certainly see it in the cattle. The last row of this chart talks about carrier status. We won't go into a lot of detail with that, but again, cattle tend to carry it for up to 6 months. Sheep can carry it up to 12 months. So when we start thinking about a control program, we have to keep that in mind as well. One of the most important things I hope you walk away with tonight is that foot and mouth disease is not considered a public health or a food safety concern. It's very much an animal disease. So how is it spread between animals? Well, through aerosol, direct contact, fomites, or oral. So animals will shed the virus in multiple different excretions. So if that contaminates something else, like a fomite, boots on people's hands, their clothing, that's one way it can go from one animal to another. How does it actually get into that animal? Well, direct contact with a vesicle. Those vesicles are like blisters on the feet and on the mouth, and so they rupture and that fluid comes out. That is infective. If anything is transmitted, calf to, dam to offspring, through the milk, through saliva, shed in the feces, shed in the urine. Aerosol really requires the proper temperature and humidity. We're dealing with the coronavirus, the COVID outbreak, and we talk about droplet size and the distance that droplets can travel. It's kind of the same thing for a lot of animal viruses as well. So things need to be environmentally just right for that virus to be able to be carried on the air for any length of time. Clinical signs in sheep and goats, I mentioned earlier that they're kind of the silent shedders. So we see very mild signs, if at all. Sometimes the animal will have a fever, be a little lame. They might have some oral lesions, and that's what you're seeing in the picture on the screen is the tongue of a sheep. And you can see just the little erupted blisters on that sheep's tongue. So if that animal is a little bit off feed, not too anxious to be up at the bunk or grazing, again, that might be an indicator. Because they're not going to be consuming as much because their mouths are sore, that's where the foot and mouth disease name comes from, they'll have decreased milk production. And again, just don't grow right because they're not eating as they should. When we think about our younger animals, we will see death in lambs and kids generally due to a heart problem, a cardiac infarction or infection leading to heart failure. Reproductive signs are the ones that are most commonly seen. So we might see abortion in our ewes, and the rams themselves may be more reluctant to mate. Again, foot and mouth disease. So the lesions are on the feet and in the mouth. So anything that's going to impair mobility will definitely show up as a clinical sign in a sheep affected by FMD. Again, I really want to reiterate, FMD is not a public health threat or a food safety concern. It's an animal disease. Infections in humans are very, very rare. In fact, they date back about 70 years that we've really even got any good data on that. So properly cooked milk and meat products are safe to eat and drink. Next, we'll talk about what would happen if the United States were to experience a foot and mouth disease outbreak. The USDA, or United States Department of Agriculture, has what's called the Red Book. It's their FMD response plan. In it, if you were to open it up, and it's available on the USDA website, you can find the capabilities needed, the critical activities that would have to occur for an animal disease outbreak, in this case, foot and mouth disease. It talks about what happens to an infected farm or some farms that are suspected of having that disease, meaning that they have animals with clinical signs, but we don't yet have diagnostic test results back yet, or farms that are in contact with either an infected or a suspect farm. You might share delivery vehicles, for instance. You might share workforce. So we really have guidance in this Red Book that talks about those types of premises and how to manage them. The overall goal with any foreign animal disease by USDA is to detect, control and contain that disease, in this case, foot and mouth disease, as quickly as possible. Our eventual goal is to eradicate it. We don't want to keep this disease around. So the document you see before you provides approaches to facilitate continuity of business. How do we continue to move non-infected animals and their products in a way that we still have food on our shelves for our consumers? So in the Red Book, there's a variety of tools to control foot and mouth disease. One of those is stop movement. That was used in all of those North American outbreaks I described earlier. We're going to go into a little detail about the national movement standstill approach. Another approach described in the Red Book is stamping out, or mentioned depopulation. And that's a control mechanism that's very much on the table. There are a lot of parameters around how that could and should be used. Biosecurity is imperative. Even while we're waiting to maybe depopulate a flock of sheep or a herd of cattle, biosecurity is going to be absolutely necessary to make sure that we're containing that virus within that population and not spreading it to other animals. Trace back and trace forward becomes very important when we start talking about foreign animal diseases. The OIE, the World Organization for Animal Health, states that the incubation period for foot and mouth disease is 14 days. It could be shorter, but they err on the longer side. And when we start talking about tracing, we look at 2 incubation periods. So that's 28 days. So where were animals, where were people, where was movement happening? We need to be able to go back that much in time to figure out kind of the epidemiology or how this disease is spreading. Another tool is rapid diagnostics. We have excellent diagnostics for clinical animals, animals that are actually showing lesions, as you saw in the pictures earlier. We're very much lacking in rapid diagnostics for animals that don't have any clinical signs. So if we're suspicious of, we don't have excellent diagnostics for those animals to be able to say, no, they do not have this infection. Vaccination is another tool. There's a few different ways that the Red Book describes using it. One is vaccinate to kill. And what that means is it could also be vaccinate to slaughter. So go in and do some vaccination around that population of animals to try and kind of slow the burn, right? We talk about it from a fire perspective is we might do some vaccinations around that infected premises so that those animals around them have some type of immunity and we can slow the spread of it. We can also vaccinate to live. So again, a lot of details about vaccination in that FMD Red Book. This is a picture from Denver, Colorado's National Western Stock Show that happens every year. This data came to us from the Department of Agriculture in Colorado and the Institute for International Animal Diseases in Infectious Animal Diseases at Texas A&M's Ag Connect kind of visualized it for us. So when we start thinking about a stop movement procedure, you can barely see some of the states in the Midwest, because what this is showing is movements based on movement records coming into that stock show. And you can see we don't show Canada, but we definitely bring animals in from Canada to the stock show. So just kind of illustrates one event, one big event, but how much movement has to happen. And if we were to think about how do we stop that movement, sometimes that can be a little daunting. We have a great example that we're all dealing with, right? COVID. When we thought about stopping people movement, you know, in January, people would have thought there's no way that could happen across the United States. Well, March happened, April happened, and we did do that. So this is definitely one of the strategies, is to stop movement, because that's one way to stop disease spread. So we have a document that talks about how would you manage stopping movement. And so this is across, you know, any livestock species. One of the scenarios we give in there is landing the planes. And this is what happened on 9/11. The first tower was hit, and the FAA put out a notice, you know, be on alert. After the second plane was hit, within 45 minutes, the FAA had given the alert to all pilots in the air to say, safely get to your destination, turn off the flight, or turn off the plane and get out. We're going to wait and see what needs to happen before we're going to restart movement. And we were shut down for about 72 hours on any airline traffic after 9/11. Now, that tragic event is nothing I want to make light of, but it gives us a really good understanding of what might have to happen in a livestock stop movement type order. And so how could we do that in a safe way, right? This document talks through how do we get to our destination, or if you're so close to home, can you turn around and bring those animals back? The goal is no new movements of livestock for a period of time. And right now the proposal is 72 hours. That would give us time to get our arms around where is this infection, do some of that early traceability to find out where it's moving from, where it may have moved to, and how do we overall detect, control, and quickly contain with the goal of ultimate eradication. So this managed movement document is available on the Secure Sheep website that describes those details. So the first thing that would happen in an outbreak is what we're referring to as a national movement standstill. And the proposal is 72 hours. It could be longer than that, could be shorter than that, but highly unlikely based on how we move animals, is it's going to take a good 72 hours nationally to halt movement and start investigating where is this disease. During that 72 hours is when control areas need to be established. And what those are, as you see on the screen, there's a little white dot with a pink circle around it and a blue circle around that. That whole area is considered the control area. And in that area, we put a little more requirements on animal movement and try to document things a little bit better so that we know what's moving into, within, or out of that control area. So the goal is within those 72 hours, we've got a positive diagnosis for a farm, a control area can be established around it, and the traceability starts wholeheartedly. Now, if that farm happens to be an infected premises or contact or suspect, the FMD Red Book is kind of the guidance that our state and federal officials can use to get their arms around FMD and how to contain and control it. For those that are not infected with FMD, that's where the secure food supply plans come in. So tonight you tuned in to hear more about the secure sheep and wool supply plan, but know that it's a counterpart to secure pork, secure beef, and secure milk supply. So if you are in that control area and not infected with the disease, but affected by these movement controls, that's the toolkit that you can refer to as far as guidance goes. Now, after the 72 hours is up, all of the states will reevaluate what do they know at the time, and that's when the standstill can be lifted for those places outside the control area. We may have one control area, we may have 17, it's hard to know, but the goal is to try and get business moving again as fast as possible, as long as it's a safe movement. Stamping out is another tool that was used again in our last outbreak, which happened in California in 1929. You see these pictures are black and white. We don't have any newer pictures because we've been fortunate to keep this disease out. But our farms look a whole lot different than they did back in 1929. The movement of animals and animal products looks very different than it did then. So that is reason why the secure food supply plans came about. So once foot and mouth disease is diagnosed, we talked about establishing that control area. Anything that needs to move into, within, or out of that control area needs to do so by permit. And those permits are going to be based on risk. There are some movements that aren't as risky as others. You might be wondering, well, what's a risky move? Well, live animals. When we talk about how animals shed this virus, especially our pigs and cattle, the movement of a live animal poses a bigger risk than, say, something contained in a truck that's sealed up, an animal product, for instance. So the secure food supply plans are aimed at business continuity for those farms that are affected by these movement controls, but not infected with foot and mouth disease virus. The goal behind business continuity plan is to control or eradicate that disease without destroying the industry, trying to minimize those unintended negative effects. The way that's done is with risk-based solutions. So we've, for years, worked on, what does the data tell us? What is the science behind it? What are the risk assessments telling us? What do we have for national guidelines? And with 2/3 of the world having foot and mouth disease, what are some of the international guidelines? We've been pretty darn successful keeping this disease out, but what does that look like overall as far as the guidance behind it? So the secure food supply plans, in this case sheep and wool, very much based on risk, science, and guidelines that are already established. Again, trying to get safe, high-quality food available to our consumers. Secure Sheep and Wool joins a plethora of secure food supply plans around foot and mouth disease prevention. We also have a whole set of secure poultry supply plans around high-path avian influenza. So Secure Sheep and Wool, while it came later than all the rest, certainly built off of all the lessons learned throughout all of these other programs. All of these on the screen, Secure Milk, Secure Pork, and Secure Beef, were funded by USDA APHIS. Secure Pork Supply has also gotten funding from the National Pork Board, and in fact, they're continuing to support it. African swine fever has been a big driver there because of the threat, the risk that is posed to our U.S. swine producers. So Secure Pork Supply not only looks at foot and mouth, but also African swine fever and classical swine fever. And then our wonderful partners at the American Sheep Industry Association took note and said, we need to have a secure sheep and wool supply plan. So they solely funded the development of the resources I'm going to share with you tonight. So if you were to go to Secure Milk, Secure Pork, Secure Beef, or Secure Sheep and Wool, you will find the various continuity of business plans. And we're going to hit some of the highlights of those tonight. But if you raise any of those species, I'd really encourage you to go check out what resources exist, ways to try and help protect your herd and your flock from foot and mouth disease exposure. So let's take a little deeper dive into the Secure Sheep and Wool Supply Plan. If you were to open this document up, it's not very long, it's less than 10 pages. There's an introduction, purpose. It talks about the red book that I shared with you tonight, as well as a variety of other great resources that USDA has developed over the years as it pertains to foreign animal disease prevention and control. Then there's a section on how is managed movement of animals and wool going to go in a foot and mouth disease response. Then the overall guidance, and we're going to hit on some of the resources here on how you can prepare prior to an outbreak and what happens once FMD is diagnosed in the United States, how that would change. And finally, because we talked about if you are inside this control area, the only way you're going to be able to move your animals to pasture, to market, to another location is to request a movement permit. So we'll talk about the guidance that's available for producers in this resource. So if you were to open up the last page of the Secure Sheep and Wool Supply Plan, you will find this permit guidance table, and it's for sheep, semen, and embryos. We'll talk a little bit more about wool next. This is guidance only. I do not write policy. My colleagues at Iowa State University do not write policy. We've developed guidance that our state animal health officials and our federal animal health officials can use as a template to say, how do we best manage and mitigate risk? And for a producer, how do you best meet these so that you're protecting your flock from disease exposure? One of the first things that has to happen is traceability information. We need to know where the animals are. That's the premises identification number or PIN, the GPS coordinates of where the livestock are held, and information on what needs to be moved. And then our regulatory officials are very concerned with not spreading this disease. Remember how highly contagious it is? And it's shed in the feces, the urine, those kinds of things become contaminants of other items. So we want to make sure that producers have the biosecurity measures in place so that they're not putting other flocks or herds at disease risk. Trace back and trace forward, we talked about it. We need to make sure that there's no potential risk that that farm poses to another farm that we may not know that they're infected yet. Number 4 is really important to think about is we're asking someone to take our animals or our animal products out of a control area. And some people refer to a control area as kind of the fire, right? This is where disease is actively happening. And it's not common that, the people fighting the fire will say, can you go get me some more wood and let's throw it in the center of this fire, right? Or that's usually not an approach. And so if we're going to move things into or out of that fire, that control area, we want to make sure that we're doing it in the right way. We also don't want to take a burning ember and put it on a truck and send it to another forest, right? So we need to make sure whenever we're moving animals, we're doing it in the safest way possible so we're not spreading disease. So producers, just like every other day, have a business arrangement with who gets their animal or their animal product. That business arrangement still needs to happen. That phone call has to happen with who's going to receive it. Maybe it's a slaughter plant. Maybe it's an auction market. Maybe it's the wool processor. You need to call and say, are you willing to take this? I'm in a control area. So that has to happen, as well as if it's leaving the state veterinarian for that state also needs to be okay with it coming in, because again, we don't want to put any other flocks at risk. Finally, no evidence of infection based on surveillance or disease monitoring. I mentioned we don't have great tools for animals that do not have clinical signs. So this is probably the thing that keeps me up most at night is how are we going to adequately test before we move? And there's no greater example than what our country is struggling with right now is COVID testing. It gives people some assurance that day that they're not at risk. And same thing with this highly contagious animal disease that, again, our animals have no immunity to. They've never seen this. So how do we provide no evidence of infection? I mentioned that this was for sheep, semen, and embryos. So let's talk a little bit about moving wool. So wool is a different type of risk than, say, having to move sheep to pasture, sheep to a feedlot or to a slaughter plant. So what we did, our group at Iowa State University, Center for Food Security and Public Health, looked at what does the scientific research say about wool and FMD survivability? What are some of the OIE, or the World Organization for Animal Health, international safety sanitary standards related to wool? We've got information in there about how wool can be stored for a specific temperature, for a specific time frame that will basically render it inactive. Traceability of bales will become very important. So what can be done? Some of that is described in this document. And then the specific movement recommendations based on these different procedures are described. Now, it may come to a disposal discussion, just like it may on the animal side. We may have to decide that depopulation is where we need to go. So again, there's a section in here about what do we do to dispose of wool safely so it doesn't pose a risk. So those two resources, this continuity business document with the permitting movement table and this document, talk through all of the different potential guidance options for moving animals and their wool. So what can people do to prepare now? We're going to talk through a variety of resources. We've probably heard a lot about contingency planning. This is a document that we've got available for producers when it comes to foot and mouth disease specifically. It's only 6.5 pages and it hits on a lot of highlights. So what if it hits at a time of year when you've got animals on a pasture and you need to move? What happens if they're on a public land or ready to go to a public land? What happens if you are getting ready to move a bunch of animals out of the feedlot to a harvest plant? What does the financial piece of that look like? Who owns the animals if they're headed to an auction market? What does the enhanced biosecurity need to look like so that you're prepared for it? Who do you need to communicate with? How do we do some of the basic sheep health things? How do we manage our inputs such as feed, bedding? How do we manage our outputs, right? If we've got manure management to deal with, if we've got wool to deal with, that's what this document talks about. So things that producers could read through and think about ahead of time to prepare in the event of this disease being introduced. Mentioned traceability is one of those 5 pillars on the permit guidance table. So if you don't already have a PIN, a premises identification number, you can certainly request one through the office of your state animal health official. And USDA's got a great website. Just type in USDA premises ID and this link will come up. If you already have one, and if you're part of the scrapie eradication program, you may, because they've transitioned a lot of their producers to having a premises ID number. Make sure your contact info is up to date. Make sure where animals are located are up to date. Producers will still be responsible for keeping their herd, their flocks, free of infection, just like they are today. Every day we make a disease decision, a risk management decision on how do we prevent spread or introduction of disease. What changes in an FMD outbreak is that our regulatory officials, our state and federal officials, then are responsible for protecting the health of those animals. And our state veterinarians do that now. That's why we have permit requirements to move animals into certain states. That's why we have, the guidance out there that we're not moving things. But their goal in this outbreak is to prevent spread. So they will be the ones to determine the requirements to receive a movement permit. Now, by and large, we've had excellent input and collaboration with our state veterinarians. They're very familiar with the guidance in these documents. Most of them, when you talk, say, what do you think? Well, yeah, that's the guidance we want to follow. But recognize this virus is never going to read our plan, and they don't always behave in the way that we planned for. So there may be nuances to some of the permit requirements. The business that you want to move your animals or animal products to may also have different requirements than even the regulatory officials. So again, there's going to be a lot of moving parts. So the more of this that you can think about ahead of time, the better. Now, something to keep in mind is that routine biosecurity is not going to be enough in a foot and mouth disease outbreak because it is so highly contagious. What we're going to talk about next is enhanced biosecurity. How do we do more and more stringent than we're even doing now for some of our livestock species? Again, producers' responsibility is to keep their animals from becoming infected. That doesn't change in an outbreak. It just becomes so much more important. So some of the 3 key features that you'd find in the enhanced biosecurity guidance in the Secure Sheep and Wool Supply Plan is to establish an operation-specific enhanced biosecurity plan. Should be written, should go through all the parts and pieces that the document I'll share with you in a little bit describes. Also recommends having a biosecurity manager, somebody who's in charge of developing the plan and then monitoring that it's working. And you might be scratching your head saying, I only have 25 sheep. Well, I'm not going to hire somebody. You're right, you don't. It's you, right? It's the one-man band. How can you think about biosecurity as one of the many management things that has to happen with your flock. Line of separation. The line of separation is something that protects your flock from exposure. Nothing should cross that line that can introduce virus. This becomes a little more difficult when we have animals raised outdoors. It's not an all or nothing. The concept behind line of separation can certainly help decrease the exposure risk. And we'll talk a little bit more about that soon. So if you were to go on Sheep and Wool Supply Plan website, you would find all these resources for enhanced biosecurity. We have a checklist, we have an information manual, and we have a template that you can download, write on, type into, whatever's easy. We have both forms, whether you raise animals out on pasture or rangeland or in a feedlot sitting. So securesheepwool.org under producer tab and biosecurity will provide you with all of these resources. Now, if we think about, let's say this is a feedlot, and we've got all of our animals outside, we've got various different entries. The line of separation is some border around that operation that says, look, we don't really want things crossing here unnecessarily. We want to have some type of control for what's coming in, especially in an outbreak. So the feedlot, the pasture, right, might think about that as a kingdom. And what do we do to protect a kingdom? Well, we put walls up. What do we put around our walls? A moat. And the moat, in this case, is that line of separation. Now, you don't necessarily need to go out and dig a moat around your operation, but how can you think about that as a way to protect your flock from disease exposure? Again, it's not an easy lift. And in the chaos of an outbreak, it becomes darn near impossible because clearly, this is one of those things, thinking about, you're out checking fence, you're out checking animals. Think about, well, what would I do if I had to kind of contain this, or if I had to protect my flock because somebody in the area has it? Now, how do you get into this kingdom, right? You lower a drawbridge. Who's in charge of that access point? Well, it's the kingdom, right? So who doesn't want to be king or queen of their own kingdom? And monitoring who gets to come in. And we don't necessarily want a Trojan horse coming in and introducing virus. So some biosecurity steps need to happen around that piece of equipment, that person, anything that could potentially introduce FMD virus on their person or on their vehicle or equipment into your operation. So the information manual has some graphics that talks about, well, how could this work in a pasture setup? I need to take my four-wheeler out. I need to, I have guardian dogs out there. I have guardian livestock out there. How does all that work? And, there's not one cookie cutter magic answer, but the information manual talks around this concept and some ways you might brainstorm a little bit to make it work for you. It's certainly complicated for folks grazing public land, right? There are just some beautiful things that we get to do today that in a contagious disease outbreak might pose a higher risk. So we recognize there's no zero risk of exposure. And managing this in peacetime brings some challenges, during this highly contagious disease outbreak. So thanks to the wonderful people that were part of the working group as we developed all of these materials in no less than a year, they said, there's just some unique things about grazing public land allotments that we need to think about. Did we come up with every single answer? Absolutely not. But what we started to do was kind of talk through some of those exposure risks. Common use roads, common use corrals and trailheads. What about recreationalists coming in? What if it's grazing with cattle, wildlife interactions, and all of that? The take-home message is, how do you protect the flock when they're out amongst the elements like that? Working with your state animal health official, your state veterinarian, your livestock associations prior. What could be done to minimize exposure risk? Those kinds of things happening in peacetime are ideal. Surveillance for foot and mouth disease in sheep is very different than it is in cattle or pigs. So I mentioned early on, we had, the suite of secure food supply plans that came along, and we were able to accomplish a lot in 12 months for the resources for this because we had all of those to build on. But the unique things around surveillance and some biosecurity information and the whole movement permitting based on sheep is described in the document you see before you. So again, all of these resources are available on the Secure Sheep and Wool Supply Plan. But we had to talk about this differently than what we've had in any of the other resources because sheep present foot and mouth disease very differently. So therefore, we have to manage them differently. So I mentioned that the American Sheep Industry Association funded the Secure Sheep and Wool Supply Plan. And so we at Iowa State Center for Food Security and Public Health had the great honor of working on this. So in that 12-month time, with a top-notch set of working group members, oh my goodness, they worked so hard. We were cranking documents out to them, and they were reviewing it and back and forth. It was excellent. We had about 15 major documents that came out of that, and another 13 just supportive documents. So because of that collaboration, it was definitely a success. And next, we'll talk about the website resources that you all have access to. So if you go to securesheepwool.org, you'll be able to find the resources I'll talk you through tonight. So here's a couple of pictures of the homepage. And what we'll do tonight is we'll kind of navigate around some of those different tabs you see at the top or some of the resources that are available. So resources for moving your sheep, resources for getting your PIN, your premises identification number, and more can be found on the website. We've got some handouts. They're just one-pagers, but they talk about what is foot and mouth disease, what is this Secure Sheep and Wool Supply Plan. So if you do any type of outreach, if your association wants to put this out in a newsletter or make it available, you can link to it on the Sheep and Wool website. The goal is it's succinct, very visual, trying to talk to people about what this program is. Now, as a producer, you can go into the producer tab and find a whole variety of resources. What is the most light for this set of resources is the disease monitoring piece, because clinical signs are not as common. So we're hoping to work on some more of that in this following year to try and kind of make that a little bit more robust. One of the things that needs everybody's help is better diagnostic tests for non-clinical sheep, right? We don't necessarily have animals that show clinical signs that we want to test before we move. So what could some of those diagnostic tests do? Again, that's going to take research money. Thanks to the Farm Bill, they funded information related to vaccines as well as diagnostic tests. So we're hoping that over the coming years that the research will go into this and make it more robust for us. If you were to look under the veterinarian resources, it's just a one page and it links to existing resources. The biosecurity message is not different. The disease information resources are not different, nor is the vaccination piece. The bottom, it talks about what the roles of a certificate of veterinary inspection, or sometimes referred to as a health paper, what that will look like in an outbreak. So again, all available on that website. Now, what if you need to move your animals to slaughter? Or what if you need to move wool to processing? You can go on to the Packer Processor page and find those resources as well. The North American Meat Institute has developed some great resources over the years too, and this links to that. For our regulatory officials, our state and federal partners, again, there's a little bit more detail for some of the surveillance documents and the managed movement documents than what we put on the producers page. But again, it's all public facing, so anybody can get to any section. If you go to the disease information page here, you'll find all kinds of resources related to the FMD response plan, disinfectant, all those other resources for foot and mouth disease. That permit guidance table that I shared earlier is also available on the website, and that's under the regulatory officials and the producers tab. It goes through each of those, and they're hyperlinked, so you can find the resources you need. Lastly, on the About Us portion of the website, you will be able to click on that and find out a little bit more about the American Sheep Industry Association and their involvement. as well as my partners at Iowa State University. I get to be your spokesperson tonight, but it's certainly a team effort with Doctors Jim Roth, Renee Duell, and myself on the veterinary team. We had a top-notch veterinary student intern, Clay McIntosh, working with us. And then, of course, anything we do that goes up on our website, our IT team of Vered Friedman and Andrew Kingsbury were really involved with. Now, in the coming year, we've put together a proposal with ASI to fund development of additional materials. So there's a tab on Secure Beef called Outreach, and that's kind of our training materials. And we want to be able to build out the outreach section of the sheep and wool supply plan in coming years. What that will look like, we'll have some short videos about what is the Secure Sheep and Wool Supply Plan, what is FMD. A lot of material will be developed also in Spanish, both the handouts and the videos, working on some articles and that things, short little 250, 500 word things that can be put in association newsletters, extension newsletters, to let producers know that this is a resource available for them. On the biosecurity piece of it, again, in a year we accomplished a lot, but there's more outreach that certainly needs to be done. So if we look at what's on the Secure Beef site, is a whole tab on signs and posters. So we're hoping that we can get some good images and get these signs developed in the coming year. I'm only going to touch briefly on vaccination because it does come up in all the presentations I give. FMD vaccine is a killed virus vaccine. There's about 6 of the 7 serotypes of FMD active in the world. It's not cross-protective. So if we have one type of outbreak in one part of the world and another serotype gets introduced, that vaccine is not protective against it. There's 65 subtypes. So it's kind of a mixture of issues when we start thinking about how would we start to vaccinate for FMD. We don't do it now. It's not a vaccine we use or sell in the United States, but it is the most used vaccine worldwide because it's in 2/3 of the country. So what we have to do if we were to get this is right away isolate that virus and tell us what serotype it is. And then we can select the correct vaccine that goes along with it. It's very much planned as a strategic use or an emergency use if we were to get it in the United States. It's all based in USDA's hands on how and if it'll be used. Our chief veterinary officer is who gets to make that decision. Now, they will be in lockstep with the state and listening to the industry. It's a complex decision, but we still need to rely on many of the tools we talked about tonight, biosecurity, because it's going to take a while to get vaccine into the animals. Movement control, do we do that ring vaccination? We talked about the fire, controlling that burn. The vaccination oversight piece of it is huge. From the time it leaves the manufacturer in another country until it reaches that farm, it's got to be traced the whole entire way. Who's eligible? Well, cattle are the most vaccinated animals worldwide. Pigs would be next. Sheep are not commonly vaccinated. We've learned we can control it in the cattle population and not have to vaccinate sheep necessarily. Traceability is huge. We need to keep track for our trading partners because today we enjoy trade because we're FMD free without vaccination. That is the highest category you can get from a trade perspective. Once we vaccinate, we have to be able to trace those animals through their death. So again, it's a complex issue. We have a bank and we have another bank that's being built. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but the take-home message is that the bank we have today is not sufficient to handle a densely populated livestock area, even here in Iowa. And we will get vaccine initially to be able to use, but once that's used up, it could take as long as 14 weeks to get more manufactured. So it's a very complex issue. There's a great video, it's only 8 minutes, it's available on all of the websites that talks about how vaccine can possibly be used in the United States if we were to get foot and mouth disease. So Jay, that wraps up my portion of the talk, and I welcome any questions. My email address is displayed on the screen. It's just D for Donnell, B for Bickett, W for Weddle at iastate.edu. And you can also reach our team at Iowa State University by emailing sswinfo@iostate.edu. Thanks again to the American sheep industry, not only for their funding of this program, but for the opportunity to connect with you all tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pickett-Waddell. That's a lot of information, a lot of great information developed on the website, and more to come, it looks like. So that's fantastic. We did have some questions come in during your talk, and I know some people are typing some in right now, I could see. I mentioned that if you would like to ask your question directly to Dr. Pickett-Waddell, you can do that if you have a speaker or a microphone connected to your computer. You just need to raise your hand using a little hand symbol up there on your dashboard. And if you do that, I can see you, and I will call you by name and unmute your microphone and let you talk to her directly. But let's go ahead and get to some of the questions that came in during your talk. Early on, when you had the red book up there from USDA APHIS, a couple people asked about accessing that. Is that available publicly? And do they just find that on the APHIS website that you had there, or how do they get to it if they can?
It is available publicly. You can go to your favorite search engine and just type in USDA FMD Red Book, and it should be one of the first links that come up there.
Okay, and several people have goats, apparently, because they asked during your talk if this sheep and wool plan is meant to cover goats too, or if there's something separate on the way.
Excellent question. FMD virus itself doesn't really care what species is on the other side of the fence. So there are some principles that apply across all species. The biosecurity stuff, for instance, many of the guidance pieces that are in there are similar to what was found in the beef document, the dairy document, the swine document. So if you are a goat producer and you're wondering, gosh, where do I even start? You could certainly pick up, if you're pasture raising your goats, you could certainly pick up the Secure Sheep and Wool Enhanced Biosecurity for Pastures and use that as a tool. There is strong interest in the goat industry to develop their own. And, each one of these species groups has some nuances with it. If you raise dairy goats, some of the resources in the Secure Milk Supply Plan would also pertain. But as we know, there's some nuances with dairy goat milk production that's a little different than our cattle milk production. So I know our partners on the goat side are looking at ways that they could enhance and develop some guidance as well.
Okay, very good. Well, we're talking about other species. Somebody asked about wildlife, in particular deer, elk, bighorn sheep, antelope. Do they spread this disease, or what to be concerned with there?
Cloven-hooved animals, so much of what was listed, are certainly susceptible to foot and mouth disease virus. And again, we haven't had it in North America since 1954 when Mexico had their last outbreak. But what we're learning from other countries is that if we can control foot and mouth disease in our domestic populations, and that may be through a depopulation or stamping out, stop movement, maybe vaccine, it's a way to try and control it in wildlife as well. The beauty of these programs is that USDA has got an excellent relationship with the wildlife services, and those folks are at the table every single exercise to try and figure out, what would their role be if we were to get an outbreak and there's a heavy population of wildlife. How could they play a role? So certainly animals are susceptible. We know if we control it in domestics, it becomes a non-issue in the wildlife, but they could serve as a way of moving it. Because it causes lesions on the feet, their feet get really sore. So whether we're thinking about bighorn sheep or feral pigs or, elk or deer, they're not going to have the mobility that they normally would have. So that essentially kind of helps us with the control piece of it as well. But it's certainly something that we all take into consideration as we work on these projects.
Thanks. So a question came in when you were talking about the wool, the few slides that you had there on wool. Will certain temperatures kill the disease? For example, storing wool in extremely hot or extremely cold temperature, does that affect it?
Yes, it does. And so in that document itself, it talks about, based on the OIE, or the World Organization for Animal Health sanitary standards, it gives a variety. I think there's about 6 different options for how wool could be handled. And so in talking with the processors that were a part of our working groups, and in talking with people that understand the virus, the recommendation came out for storage times and temperatures, which we tend to do certain times of the year here in the United States. The biggest maybe difference is now we would have to put some thermometers in our storage facilities and have some type of documentation that, that the temperature got to a certain temperature for a period of time. I don't have those numbers committed to memory, but they're certainly available in that wool handling document.
Okay, so a question came in. The general gist of it is, do you anticipate broader benefits to participation? But the preamble might be a little hopeful. It says, in your opinion, what are the chances that the secure food supply plan participation will be required or favored by state animal health officials, regardless of whether or not you're in a control area? For example, for producers in a state with cases of FMD, but not necessarily in a control area within that state.
Excellent question. So some of the states have expressed the desire to stop all movement within their state, and not necessarily just the control area. Some states, when they exercise, foot and mouth disease, African swine fever, high path avian influenza, doesn't matter. Some of their requirements right out of the gate are you must have a PIN and you must have a secure food supply plan that we've heard about, seen, audited, reviewed, something. So as far as favorable, yes, I would say the majority of the state animal health officials find favor in the fact that a producer is doing things in peacetime to help protect their flocks, such that they're going to be in a better position when this highly contagious disease comes in to keep their flock safe. If you are an infected farm, you don't get a chance at moving your product. If you keep it out, you certainly have a chance. And so any of this preamble work that can be done definitely helps your ability to keep your herd or your flock disease free. That's number one. And then number two, gives the state animal health officials, gives the other states, maybe gives your business partner some confidence that you could move that animal or animal product in a way that doesn't threaten another flock or another herd.
Okay. Let's see. I had one here. When you had the picture up when you were talking about the moat and the wall around the farm, a question came in on basically a neighbor question. So they live next to a field where basically a feedlot spreads manure, so that's a concern to them. And they also found a cow part in one of their fields. So they're wondering, their question is, how can I know if another farm has a disease that will affect my flock or herd? Any advice there on that general situation?
Yeah, so it depends on the state and the privacy laws. So if we were to get foot and mouth disease in the state of Iowa, we don't reveal that information. We would say that, yes, we have a case. We would say the county. Our state would know exactly where that was. Our federal officials would know exactly where that farm was. But we can't really announce that. It's a privacy law. Not all states have that. But if you were concerned, so if you were in an outbreak situation, manure is one of the things that would require a movement permit. So that feedlot may not be able to spread manure. If they're an infected farm, they certainly won't be spreading manure. But if they were in a control area just like you were, in order to move that manure, they're going to need a movement permit. To do that movement permit, there's going to have to be some biosecurity. There's going to have to be some testing to say that those animals are not going to pose, or their manure is not going to pose a risk to nearby farms. In the contingency planning document, it talks about things like that. You're going to have to sit still for a period of time. We know 72 hours is the magic number for animals, but it could be a lot longer than that. And for products that maybe don't really have to move, that they pose too high of a risk for a period of time, those might have to sit for a while. Scavengers, we know that dogs carry things from farm to farm. We know vultures carry things from farm to farm. We'll never get to a zero risk, not at all. But I think if things can happen ahead of time, talking to neighbors, figuring out, where things are spread, sometimes it is luck of the draw. But if you've got some plans and procedures in place ahead of time, and you're talking with your state animal health officials about what you're doing proactively, if you find yourself in that situation, things are locked down for a period of time, you may have a better opportunity to move your animals if you've kept them disease-free.
Okay, thanks. And we do have one hand raised right now, so I'm going to go ahead and unmute Cheryl Meacham. Cheryl, are you there? Cheryl, it looks like you've muted yourself. You can unmute yourself. I'll give you a couple seconds here. Okay, we'll go back to the submitted questions then. Lots of folks with experience, or at least a recent observation of the UK, weighed in and what a extremely bad situation that was. But one of the questions that came in on that was, in the UK outbreak, they used serology in some sheep flocks to determine if they had been exposed and hadn't shown clinical signs. Would that maybe be part of the surveillance for FMD in sheep flocks?
Yeah, so we, in our document about the factors to consider, do a deeper dive into the surveillance options that do exist. And so, with our testing capabilities, a lot of what we'll do initially is trying to test the infected farms, right, to find it. And then when we start to do surveillance around those infected farms, that's where I want to say the jury is still out. So we can do serology as long as we've got the reagents and the testing capabilities at our labs. Certain labs are the only ones that can do testing for highly contagious diseases like foot and mouth disease. We're trying to figure out, are there other types of tools that we can do? We don't have anything pen side or shoot side at this time, but those are definite desires. So yes, there's a variety of diagnostic tests that could be a part of our response plan as well.
Okay. I had a couple more questions here. One related to basically humans. It says 12 to 15 years ago at a sheep-related workshop, speaker said that FMD could be carried in the lungs of people exposed to FMD, and that therefore veterinarians who travel to a country area with FMD are forbidden from contact with livestock for 2 to 3 weeks. Is this correct? And in implementing biosecurity, should I not allow people who travel to areas of FMD to come to my farm, and for how long, and where do I get a list of these countries with FMD?
Okay, excellent question. So early on, when, as with anything, right, we learn about a disease and then new technologies come and we learn more. So there used to be the thought that humans in their nasal passages, so kind of deep nasal passages, but still up in the head, could carry FMD virus. Not that they were going to get it, right? But if they were in a laboratory setting and they breathed it in, it would kind of sit in that mucus at the back of your throat. So they've done some studies and they've learned that humans carry that for less than 24 hours. We used to think it was longer. Based on what we do know, if someone works or is in a facility that's got animals that are positive, or a country that's got animals that are positive, the general recommendation is that you should not contact any susceptible livestock, so again, anything with cloven hooves, for a minimum of 5 days. So we have veterinarians that get trained at our USDA facilities off the coast of New York. So there's an island called Plum Island, and they'll go out there and they'll actually see this disease live in animals. So when they come back from that, they're not to be around livestock for 5 days. So that's kind of been the general rule. If you've got a livestock operation that you maybe don't want to have people visiting from foreign countries, walking on your facility, 5 days of being in country is generally the standard. The OIE, the World Organization for Animal Health, has a an infectious disease database. And so you can actually search for what countries they're coming from and what their disease status is, not only for FMD, but for a variety of other diseases. So OIE, WAHIS are the letters that you could type into your search engine, and it would show you the WAHIS database that shows where disease is throughout the world for any country that reports it. There's a little asterisk behind that statement because some countries do not report disease. So those are just the ones that report it.
Excellent. Sounds like some good information there. Related to that, what is the rule of thumb time to keep equipment quarantined between pastures and farms before use? Anything on equipment?
Yeah. So the biggest thing is, what is the equipment contaminated with? So sunlight, hot temperatures, dry temperatures. So FMD virus is not super stable just in the environment. It's when it's protected in feces or saliva or blood or anything like that. So, you know, if the piece of equipment is clean and doesn't have a lot of manure buildup on it or bedding or anything like that, you know, good old sunshine and some hot temperature days will do all kinds of good to that. So not necessarily a magic number of days. It's more important that the piece of equipment or the livestock trailer is cleaned such that the virus doesn't have a place to live and survive. It'll live in the soil, it'll live in manure for extended periods of time. So it's really important that that equipment gets cleaned first. There's a whole list of disinfectants that go through, you know, what can you do as far as cleaning up your equipment. And I can show you quick on the website. So the search engine is a really easy place to find it. So if you typed in disinfectant, it's going to show you a whole list of things related to disinfectants. Look, approved disinfectants for foot and mouth disease. So here's a resource on the website available that would talk through that. And we've got things related to cleaning and disinfection that talk through, you know, how would you do that?
Excellent. And one final question on the website itself. So this Secure Sheep and Wool website has a lot of information on it. You talked about improving it with more information and resources, maybe more training modules. Their question is, will this website provide training courses like the Beef Quality Assurance Program that provide a person a certificate?
At this point, there's not planned, I would say, traceable online modules. The goal generally with these websites are to provide some basic overview information, but there's no certification program associated with any of the secure food supply plans at this point. We have done some work with Beef Quality Assurance on a biosecurity chapter in their latest manual. They're working on some biosecurity recommendations that are in lockstep with the secure beef supply plan. But to my knowledge, there's nothing planned specifically for certification modules around secure sheep and wool supply.
Okay. Thank you. And thank you for a great presentation this evening, Dr. Pickett-Weddell, and for answering all these questions. And thank you to all of our listeners for submitting the questions. We all learn from that throughout the country. People are really glad when they see people ask good questions and see them answered online. So we appreciate that. Oh, there's your handling equipment deal. Okay. Do you want to say a few words about it?
Yeah. So again, just because in only an hour tonight, didn't have a chance to go into a deep dive on any of the resources, but please know that the website, if you just typed in the word wool, you're going to find the resources that I'm showing on the screen is wool handling. So the question came in about temperatures and storage and all of that. So again, this comes out of the OIE, Terrestrial Animal Health Code, procedures for the inactivation of FMD in wool and hair. So we're not proposing anything different than what our international trade partners are, but it will go into some details about how to clean it, how it should be stored, how to trace it. That's what that document shows. So just wanted to let your viewers know that There's a lot more on the website than we could even go into detail tonight, but the search tool will get you just about everything that you need.
Wow, fantastic. And thank you to you and your colleagues for putting all of this together. And thanks to the American Sheep Industry Association for providing the funds to make it happen. I think everybody's going to find this to be a tremendous resource.
We appreciate the opportunity to connect. And again, thanks to ASI for funding it and believing that this was something that was needed, because we sincerely agree.
Okay. And thank you to everybody that joined us this evening. Once again, this ASI webinar was brought to you with funding support from the Let's Grow Committee, and we encourage you to visit the ASI website at www.sheepusa.org to access their materials, and I'm sure they'll have a link up there, if they don't already, to this Secure Sheep and Wool supply website, and we encourage you to visit that and access these wonderful materials that have been put together. So with that, I'll go ahead and bring this to a close and encourage you to join us again for our upcoming webinars. We expect to have another one here in about a month from now. We should be some information coming out on that in the next week to 10 days, and we encourage you to join us for that webinar also. So with that, I'll go ahead and thank Dr. Bickett-Weddle one more time, and everybody for being here, and I wish everybody a good evening.